Hi everyone. So, in the season 3 finale of The White Lotus, there was one scene in particular where I felt directly called out, and that was when Piper told her parents that she decided against moving to Thailand to live at the monastery. In classic White Lotus fashion, the character who thinks they're morally superior to their hyper-privileged family members turns out to be not so woke after all. Like, yeah, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. But my initial reaction was to jump to Piper's defense. I don't think it's fair to paint her as this bougie, spoiled princess for not wanting to give up AC for a year in Thailand, where it's hot as fuck, okay? I also understand why she didn't want to eat bland food for a year. No thank you. I don't think Piper is pathetic for changing her plans and admitting she doesn't want to give up creature comforts like tasty food and air conditioning and live like a monk for an entire year. That is quite the pendulum swing from the life she's used to. Sure, air conditioning is a privilege, but it's pretty damn necessary if you ask me. Living without it definitely diminishes your quality of life. Like I said, these were my initial thoughts. But reading the book The Day the World Stops Shopping by J.B. McKinnon forced me to confront my beliefs regarding AC in particular. Maybe Piper is a pampered princess, and so am I. Okay, spoilers out of the way, I want to talk a little bit about my upbringing. I grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia. Summer in the southern United States is very hot and humid. We started school in August for some reason, I don't know. And I remember walking home from the bus stop having to peel off my sweaty skinny jeans because we weren't allowed to wear shorts to school. Conservative Christian dress code policies were the norm, even at public school. Okay, technically we were allowed to wear Bermuda shorts, but those were very unfashionable. And I was a child who wanted to fit in. Anyway, my parents were not as wealthy as the Ratliffs, but we were certainly not poor. My dad worked in sales in the heating and air business and went on to start his own HVAC company. In other words, my dad is responsible for destroying the planet. I'm kidding, mostly. So, because I grew up in the middle class in the 90s in the American South, air conditioning was so normal and widespread that I took it for granted and didn't see it as the first world luxury it is. Quickly, let's make a distinction between basic human necessities, privileges, and luxuries. There are many things I'm privileged to have that are not luxuries. It's a privilege to have potable water, as over 2 billion people do not. But water is a basic human necessity. Of course, necessity is a relative term. There are the bare necessities of life, like food, water, and shelter. And then there are the necessities of a decent life. These include things like filtered water and basic kitchen appliances. You could argue that cell phones are a necessity in modern society. But there's another category of privileges that aren't necessities but aren't luxuries either. An in-unit washing machine, for example. The Oxford Dictionary defines luxury as the state of great comfort and extravagant living. I would consider a luxury something that exceeds the bounds of one planet living. The one planet metric is how many Earths it would take to sustain your lifestyle if everyone lived as you do. There is room for some luxury items or habits in a one planet lifestyle if you sacrifice in other areas, but generally speaking, a luxury is something that cannot be adopted by everyone. Potable water and washing machines may be a privilege in our deeply unequal capitalist global society, but we have enough resources on Earth for everyone to have these things. Unfortunately, air conditioning falls into the luxury category. That doesn't mean using AC in moderation during a heat wave is a luxury, but our current use, based on the modern conception of room temperature, is. I knew that blasting AC in nearly every commercial building in the US was excessive, but I didn't see my own modest use as gluttonous until I read The Day the World Stops Shopping. To quote McKinnon, air conditioning, as we know it now, involves a lot of consumption. It uses more electricity than any other household activity, followed closely by heating. It has become a part of what is sometimes called invisible or inconspicuous consumption. Consumption that we carry out because that's the way things are done. That's the way the system is designed. We cannot achieve a lower consuming society without confronting it. It is our infrastructure and institutions and adoption of new technologies that define what is normal. Quote, normal life turns out to be riddled with changing expectations, patterns, and constructions that can greatly increase our personal consumption. Many of them, sociologist Elizabeth Shove found, relate to the 3 C's: comfort, cleanliness, and convenience. Home heating and cooling are examples of shifting standards in comfort. He goes on to describe all the things people used to do to warm up in the winter and cool down in the summer. People had fans blowing and awnings for shade. They drew the curtains in the daytime and opened the windows at night. They used ice packs, drank cold beverages, and took cold showers. In the winter, they wore sweaters and long underwear and bundled up in blankets. They sipped hot beverages and sat by the wood-burning stove or fireplace. Now, Americans are so accustomed to heating and air conditioning that the only ones who still do these things are those on a tight budget. We may still drink cold beverages in the summer and hot beverages in the winter, but it's more for the vibes. I suppose I'm not surprised, but the US is the air conditioning capital of the world. China may have the greatest number of AC units, but per capita, the US is number one, with more AC units than people. The concept of room temperature didn't exist until the advent of air conditioning. For millennia, we adapted to seasonal temperature changes, but now we spend the majority of our lives around room temperature, which is 22 degrees Celsius or 71 degrees Fahrenheit. And because of this, our bodies are less tolerant of heat and cold, and our metabolisms have slowed as a result of never needing to use energy to heat or cool ourselves. Going back to this idea of needs versus luxuries, we've actually created a need for AC, making it simultaneously a luxury and a necessity, at least for many people. Air conditioning changed the entire landscape of America. There has been a mass migration to areas that were once scarcely populated due to stifling summer heat. And the sad irony is that our use of AC is a significant driver of climate change, which has created an even greater need for AC. This is detailed in the New York Times podcast episode titled How Air Conditioning Conquered America.
Well, Emily, what did the American landscape look like when people did have to contend with the heat in the days before air conditioning?
So I think about two big things in particular. One is that the buildings that we spend time in looked different. We designed houses and other kinds of buildings in ways that were really sort of thoughtfully trying to contend with the temperature outside. And so you've got these buildings in the Southwest in the United States that have these thick adobe walls that do a really good job of keeping the sun and its heat out. You've got these cottages and bungalows in the Southeast that are raised up off the ground so that they're not kind of receiving the heat that's absorbed by the earth. They've got big windows. They're thinking a lot about cross ventilation. They've got high ceilings so that as heat rises inside your home, you're not marinating in it while you're sitting in your living room. They've got front porches where people sit at the end of the day in order to try to cool off. And then you've got the building like the one I grew up in Chicago, which I mentioned, these sort of thick brick masonry buildings, which are also designed in a way that is making it possible for me to grow up in the 1980s and 90s and be okay with the fact that I don't have air conditioning.
Because brick kind of retains cool air.
Right. And so part of what results from all of this is that the buildings in Georgia look different from the buildings in Arizona, look different from the buildings in Chicago, because in each of those places, we're designing buildings that react to the particular climate in those environments. And so this is the first big change. Think of a time when you have to design a building to interact with what's going on outside, with how humid it is, with how hot it gets. But the other thing that was very different in the pre-air conditioning environment is that there were just a lot fewer people living in the parts of the United States that were really hot and swampy. So, it's kind of incredible to think about it, but like 1940, there are fewer people living in the state of Florida than living in the state of Arkansas.
Wow.
There are about 8,000 people total living in the city of Las Vegas. Dallas and Houston are nowhere to be found on the list of the largest cities in America. So fundamentally, before air conditioning, there just aren't a lot of people living in places where it is uncomfortable if you're not controlling the temperature in some way.
Right. If it's too hot, then you just don't live there.
Right. So climate shapes your decisions about where to live. It shapes your decisions about how to build housing. It shapes your decisions about where to spend your time in your house. Maybe you go onto your front porch in the evening when it's cooling down. In many ways, our behavior is shaped by the climate.
Mm-hmm.
And then air conditioning comes along and it totally changes everything that I've been talking about because now the outdoor climate doesn't really affect what your life is like indoors.
Walk us through how our reliance on air conditioning is both, as you just said, unsustainable and perhaps even kind of dangerous to us.
So the first obvious thing that it does is it just requires an enormous amount of energy for so many people to be air conditioning so many spaces all the time. So there's a ton of energy use happening here, but part of what's also happening is that all of these buildings have been fundamentally designed to consume lots of energy. A lot of these buildings were built during a time, in the 50s and the 60s and in more recent years where energy was cheap. The idea that you're designing a building that demands lots of energy, who cares? We're not paying a ton of money for the energy. And in the 60s and in the 50s, we weren't particularly thinking about whether or not using energy is going to cause climate change. So because of this, we get this glut of inefficient houses. And this happens not just with houses, but with everything in the built environment. Think about strip malls, shopping centers, workplaces, even offices. This sort of ubiquitous, tall, boxy, glass-covered office building that we think about in cities all over the country, all over the world, this is a building that is born out of the air conditioning age. That glassy box is designed around air conditioning such that, without air conditioning, those kinds of offices don't make sense. When you think about tall glass office buildings, they're basically greenhouses if you're not controlling the air inside. They're designed such that not only do you not have to open a window in order to cool off, you couldn't open a window even if you wanted to. These buildings don't have windows that open because they're designed to be these hermetically sealed environments where we're going to keep the outside climate out and we're going to control the climate on the inside. And this idea that the outside doesn't matter is true in the design of so many of our buildings, our offices, even our homes. And that actually puts people into an incredibly vulnerable situation.
And vulnerable how exactly?
So let's assume a storm comes through and the power goes out, or your air conditioning stops working because you've been running it all the time, all summer long. Or when we have these extreme heat conditions and the electric utility tells you, please try to preserve the amount of air conditioning that you're using. What happens when all of a sudden millions of people who have been living in an environment designed entirely around air conditioning can't have that air conditioning? Like, we start to see real problems. And, this isn't abstract. Like, we have actually seen this happen in the United States, even this year, in other recent years, where terrible storms have ripped through the state of Texas and millions of people have been left without power. And when this happens in the middle of a heat wave, people die.
Right. And that seems like an example of the multiple ways that air conditioning conspires to make us avoid contending with the realities of heat. To return to this idea you introduced earlier on, AC allows more people to go to a place like Texas than they'd ever go if there weren't AC making them comfortable, and to design and live in homes and offices that become a cauldron without air conditioning when it fails.
Exactly. I mean, air conditioning makes it possible for people to believe that you could be comfortable in Texas in the summer, in Arizona in the summer. And so people move to these places in large numbers. And then when the air conditioning fails, they're sort of suddenly thrust into a world where they're living in the middle of the Arizona desert, or they're living in the middle of Texas on a 110-degree day. And that could be life-threatening.
Especially with climate change making it even hotter in these places, it doesn't really seem sustainable for a lot of people to live in those places without air conditioning, without some kind of artificial tempering of the environment.
Yeah, and it's not just because of the heat. I mean, is it sustainable for a metropolitan area of 5 million people to exist in Phoenix in the middle of the desert when there's also not enough water there for everyone? So air conditioning sort of lulls people into moving to these places, which might be problematic for lots of other reasons as well. But we've sort of convinced ourselves that the climate doesn't matter. We're going to control it. We're going to engineer our way into living with it. I mean, there have been people living in the region of Phoenix for centuries. So it's not that nobody can ever live there. But what air conditioning does is it enables millions of people to live there who don't actually want to contend with 100-degree temperatures all summer long. So a place like Phoenix then becomes this perfect example where we now have 5 million people living in the middle of the Arizona desert, and they all have this expectation of comfort there, that any environment that I move into, in my home, in my office, in my car, I should be encased in this sort of cooling, calm, 72-degree humidity-controlled environment. And that sense of comfort becomes so deeply entrenched kind of culturally. And this isn't just about Phoenix, this is about sort of all of us. I think we have set up an expectation or even an entitlement around comfort such that it makes it really difficult to start to ask people, do you really need to turn up your air conditioning today?
During the 1973 oil crisis, Republican President Nixon addresses the American people. As a result of air conditioning, the average American will consume as much energy in the next 7 days as most other people in the world will consume in an entire year. He then encourages people to turn up their thermostats a few degrees. Imagine what that number is today, and imagine a Republican politician saying this today. Like, holy shit. To quote McKinnon again, many energy and environmental policies aim to meet narrow standards of comfort more efficiently, which misses the point. It's the overly narrow view of comfort that's the big environmental issue, not the efficiency with which it's met. Efforts to green consumption have dramatically boosted the energy efficiency of heating and cooling technologies, and the buildings they heat and cool. Consider, though, that we could have made great strides in an instant simply by turning our thermostats up or down a couple degrees and adapting. Sadly, these improvements in efficiency are outpaced by the growing demand for heating and AC worldwide. But sociologist Elizabeth Shove writes, what people take to be normal is immensely malleable. Since there are no fixed measures of comfort, cleanliness, or convenience, it is perfectly possible that future concepts will be less environmentally demanding than those of today. She points to Japan's national Kurubizu, or Cool Biz program, which encourages workplaces to leave the air conditioning off until indoor temps climb to 28 degrees. That's 82 degrees Fahrenheit. At the same time, a PR campaign has shifted social expectations around summertime business wear, from suits and ties to light pants and even Hawaiian-style shirts. The program has reduced carbon emissions by millions of tons. Amazing! God, it's so depressing how solvable the climate crisis is, yet we just carry on with business as usual. In conclusion, technological improvements in efficiency may allow for moderate use of AC in a one-planet lifestyle. But we must also shift our standards of comfort and business attire, because maintaining room temperature year-round is not sustainable, even with greener tech. Since I've moved back to Georgia and I'm currently living in an apartment above a garage, I don't think I can live without AC this summer. But I'm going to let my husband win the years-long fight over the thermostat and just suck it up and adapt. We both agreed that it's easier to tolerate the heat during the day, but at night, we're keeping it as low as I like it, so I can sleep. Thank you so much for watching. Please give this video a thumbs up, and stay tuned for my sister video, diving deeper into the one planet lifestyle. Alright, peace out.